impact on our nation's health. We've all been impacted directly or indirectly by the great health crisis. We're about to explore how to address the second great financial crisis of this century, and perhaps the worst financial crisis in 300 years. There is no one I would trust more to guide us through that than Professor Jonathan Haskell. Jonathan is Professor of Economics at Imperial College Business School. In addition, amongst many roles, he was 9 years member of the Competition Commission. Since 2016 has been a non-executive director of the UK Statistics Authority. He's co-author of Capitalism Without Capital, a hugely important book, and according to the FT and The Economist, one of the best books of the year. And since May 2018, he's been a member of the Bank of England's Policy Committee. So we will have some time for questions at the end. So please post your questions in the Q&A section. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Haskell. Over to you.
David, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction, and good afternoon, good morning or good evening, wherever you happen to be. Everybody, thank you all so much for coming on to the meeting today. I'm absolutely delighted to be talking here at Imperial, which hopefully you can see behind me if you haven't been to Imperial College before. That's what it looks like from the outside. So let me advance straight away to tell you what some of my main messages are going to be today. I'm going to try to talk for about half an hour or so, maybe a little bit longer, and then David and I will hopefully field some questions. So here are my main messages, beginning over on the left here, from the public health point of view, which of course Imperial is incredibly involved in, and you would have read so much about on the papers and heard so much about on the news and the radio. We've had an enormous shock to our public health, but what I'm going to talk about today, without at all minimizing the seriousness and the suffering that people have gone through, but I'm going to talk what is to hopefully my comparative advantage, which is the economic side. And the way I want to sort of discuss this is that in some sense this is a supply shock. So there's a picture of the Phantom of the Opera in the UK, which you can't go to. So the supply of theatrical performances has been attenuated. But the trouble is, from an economic point of view, that it's going to transmogrify into a demand shock as well when we get some worried consumers about their health. I'm going to talk then, moving over to the right, about some of the key economic challenges this gives the private provision of health, the public provision of health, and then what our policy stance should be. So let me walk through what our plan of attack today is going to be. Firstly, I'm going to model the lockdown cascade. So there's going to be just a little bit of an insight, the type of modeling we've been doing. Secondly, since everybody many people on this call are all stuck at home, let's do a bit of traveling. I want to talk about eating out in Texas and see what the experience of doing that is. Then I want to say something about saving for a rainy day, and then also at the very end, talk about the Phantom of the Opera, not in London, but how they do it in Seoul. Okay, so let's get started then with how economists sort of think about this shock. And one way in which we want to do it is we want to scale it in some way. And one of the scaling ways we do it is to look in historical terms. And so here's a graph which goes back to about the 1860s. You can see some of the key economic episodes there. The 1918 flu pandemic and the 1920s return to the gold standard, a substantial fall in GDP. You can see the financial crisis here as well. And here's what the COVID-19 pandemic looks like in terms of our fall in GDP. So a very considerable shock. And indeed, if you look over at the, this is hardly a good league table, but some sort of league table. It looks like this is going to be the worst shock to growth since, for about 300 years, since 1706. So that's the kind of background to all of this. And then what we want to understand, therefore, is a way of seeing if we can model the fall in output and then the recovery as well. So I want to just try to talk about how it is that we model this red line that I'm pointing to now, and how we think about the extent to which the economy will recover. Will we come back to the black line? Will it be more like the blue? Will it be more like the red. So those are the two stages of the talk. So let's just talk then about the immediate impact. Let me start with the immediate impact of the economy by beginning with what, in a sense, is everybody's favorite model of the economy. And I'm going to call this an input-output cascade model of the economy. And it goes like this. So at the bottom here is any old arbitrary restaurant. This happened to be my late grandfather's favorite restaurant. And if you think about the restaurant business, what does it do? It needs to buy in lots of food from the agricultural sector. It needs to buy in accountancy services from the accountant sector to make sure that everything is going on okay. And then it needs to buy in lots of labor market services, from the local labor market. And so the obvious way to think then about a shock which hits the economy is to suppose that, as is the case with the pandemic, we have to close all the restaurants. And then if we have to close all the restaurants, then what do? Well, we close off the demand for all those different factors in the economy. And that, it seemed to me, would be a very sensible way of thinking about how it is that we try to model these economic effects. In the same way that the epidemiologists that you'll have read about at Imperial and elsewhere are thinking about modeling the the extent to which the health service will be put under strain. This is a sort of very simple model, and it accords with what a lot of people think. And it turns out that we can implement this model relatively conveniently, owing to the hard work of the Office of National Statistics. And what the Office of National Statistics do is they essentially put together, they gather an enormous amount of data in order to put together a table which tells you about all the purchases that go between these different sectors. Now, this table, and here I apologize, there's going to be a lot of numbers in this table, but I'm going to walk you through this table here. This table tells you a little bit about how to interpret that cascade effect. And these are real data which you can download. The link is just there for those of you who want to download this. And I'll put some notes up on my webpage, which walks you through how all this works. So let's understand what's going on here. So on the column here, if you're looking at this on the phone, you may not be able to see this, but let me walk you through this. On the column here, all the various industries, so the agriculture, manufacturing and production, construction, distribution, and so forth. And what the ONS do is they measure the sense in which the output of all these industries here flows to the output of all the various other industries and then is bought by final consumers. So I've picked out in this box on the left-hand side with the red box there, the sales of agriculture to the production sector, and that's about £12 billion. This is in 2016. So how should you think of that? Remember, the production sector includes the food processing sector. So you should think of that as farms selling food, which is then produced in some sensible and safe way by the food processing sector. What then happens is, well, we can then trace through the extent to which the food processing sector, which is part of production, then sells on to distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants. That's obviously a broader class than just a delicatessen, but you can think of that as including the restaurant sector. So again, the agricultural sector produces all this stuff, all the food is processed and that's sold onto the restaurant sector. And then we can follow the table over to here on the right-hand side, and that tells you the sales of restaurants as well as hotels and so forth to final consumers like you and me. Since the ONS, as I say, go to the considerable hardship of collecting all of these data, they do so essentially by issuing a series of questionnaires, which asks people, which sectors, which companies they're supplying to, and figuring out their industries. We can therefore essentially say, well, what happens if we close that sector? And we can trace through the ripple effects. So if we close down hotels and restaurants, then obviously the demand is going to go down for processed food. But of course, it doesn't stop there. The demand goes down for processed food, but then the demand goes down for agriculture as well. So let me just go through that again. You can see how this ripple effect works. We close down the food sector. We close down restaurants, exactly. We close down restaurants. As I say, the demand goes down for processed food, and the demand then goes down for agriculture. And that's why this is called the input-output picture of the economy. That's how we can trace through these various ripple effects. And you can see that if we close down other sectors over here as well, let's say we close down theatres, then there'll be ripple effects as well, because the theatres are buying popcorn, and the popcorn is made by the food production sector, made by agricultural sector, and so forth. Now, if you do all of that, and as I say, students who are interested in doing this can link to that page there, you can work out something like the following. Here is the effect which I've called a cascade effect, of a situation in which we closed down 90% of hotels and food, which is pretty close to what happened in the peak of the lockdown. And you can see that obviously the accommodation and food sector goes down a very good deal, but then there's knock-on effects to all the various other sectors. So agriculture, as I mentioned, goes down as well. Accommodation and food are going to demand less electricity and gas, but of course agriculture, which has taken a knock, is going to demand less electricity and gas as well. So there's going to be effect on the electricity and gas sector. As I just mentioned, manufacturing, which would involve food processing as well, there's going to be less of that, which is demanded. But of course, manufacturing is going to demand less electricity and gas, and less agriculture as well. But essentially, but the knowledge of all of those input-output linkages is going to enable us to model all of those ripple effects. So when this pandemic first started, the way that the bank and other institutions thought about modeling this was to think about the various lockdowns there were in the individual sectors, and then model through these cascading effects through all the different industries. And it turned out that that was actually a fairly accurate model of what indeed did actually happen. So this graph here tells you the various output declines, which are in the blue, and the jobs which are furloughed, which is in the sort of pink color. Here's the total at the top here. The total output decline was around 25% from the end of the last year to May 2020. And we've just, as we've just seen historically, that's an absolutely gigantic figure. So that's the total output decline. It was concentrated in accommodation and food. But as we've just seen, it spilled over into other sectors as well. It spilled over into arts and entertainment and so forth. Those were closed down as well. The education sector was affected because that was closed down. Construction was somewhat closed down as well. Transportation and storage and manufacturing, well, these places were rather less closed down, but they still suffered via the cascade effect in the manner that I just described. And so that way of using those data is a way of trying to make precise how it is that the effects of the lockdown would ripple through the economy. So for example, here at the bottom is the ICT sector. The ICT sector wasn't really closed down per se. It wasn't like the restaurant sector or like theatres or something like that. But you can see that the ICT sector still suffered, and it suffered not as badly as everybody else, but it still suffered nonetheless via those cascade type of effects that you see there. Now, that was a forecast based on the data. And since we've done that forecast, we can now, since we've done the forecast and time has gone by, we actually now have some actual data against which to do some comparisons. This first comparison here is the actual data as came out. We can look at other aspects of the data to see other ways in which the economy was influenced. And that'll turn out to be important in the thinking about what we should do in the recovery. Now, for example, from HMRC, we can see here the take up of the furlough schemes. These are the various the share of jobs which were furloughed under the coronavirus job retention scheme. And this is data up to the June 30th. And I've broken this out in two different ways. So on the right here is the total. So around 30% of jobs were furloughed. I mean, that's just a gigantic share of the labour force essentially being supported by the government. And you can see how the incidence of this has changed on the left-hand side here by age. And so the young particularly suffered here, age 16 to 24. In a sense, that's not a surprise, because many young people, of course, work in the most affected sectors like restaurants, like hotels, and so on. So the incidence fell a lot on young people. It seems to have fallen slightly more on males as well. There was some discussion before the recession as to whether there would be more incidence on females, more incidence on males, maybe somewhat more on males. And interestingly, there's a somewhat of a peak for older workers there as well. So that's one dimension then of the heterogeneity, not only across the different sectors, but by different individuals. We can get another sense of the heterogeneity as well, based on some very, very interesting work done by the excellent researchers at the Resolution Foundation. And what we see there is, as it says at the top of the page here, the low paid have seen the most disruption. And here's something about working from home, which I'll come to in just a second. So here are the proportion of employees who've experienced, well, this is job changes at least. They're different job changes. So let's take the lowest paid, 25% of whom in the sample have been furloughed, 5% at the moment have lost their jobs, and 3% have had a reduction in their hours. And you can see that the low paid have particularly suffered there as well. The highest paid, they've had some changes, but they're rather small relative to the low paid. So again, a picture of quite a differential experience across the different sectors and across the different genders and ages, and here across the different pay groups. And here, which sort of complements that slide, the slide on the left, is the share of employees who can work from home if they needed to. So rather cleverly, there was a questionnaire, I think this is from the household panel survey, which asked people whether they could work at home. And what you can see is essentially the highest paid, they're the people over on the right hand side here, have got a much more higher propensity and ability to work from home. So the picture then is of this input-output cascade being having a differential experience across different industries, having that ripple effect, and then quite a different experience as well across different types of workers. So that was the immediate impact. Let's now ask about the recovery. Now, the key issue with the recovery is this. So let me just hop onto the slide here. Let me just ask you just to focus on the question that I pose on the slide here, which is that if we release the lockdown, will we recover? And this is what I want to spend a little bit of time on this. And the reason I want to spend a bit of time on this is you might say, well, on the basis of this cascade model, which we've just seen, isn't the obvious policy measure simply to release the lockdown? If we stopped locking down restaurants and hotels and so forth, as indeed we have been doing, if we stopped all of that, then the downward cascade that we previously saw becomes an upward cascade. And wouldn't we therefore restore all of the job losses and so forth that we'd seen earlier on? So this is something which the bank and others are reviewing very, very seriously to get an understanding of. And in order to do that, I'm going to go to some more right up to the minute data. And this is data from a data set called CHAPS. And this is based on a very large sample of debit and credit card purchases. And what the researchers at the bank have done is they've split those debit and credit card purchases up into the following headings: social purchases, hotels, restaurants, air travel; delayable, household goods, clothing, vehicle purchases, cars and things like that; work related, which is mostly travel, actually, local commuting travel, as opposed to, flying off on holiday; and then staples, including food and fuel and health and so forth. This spending data goes to the 16th of July, so it's right up to last week, and is courtesy, as I say, the ONS and the bank. So let's see what this data says. So we start we start at zero in March 2020, just when the lockdown was, and then here we see the big fall in this black line in aggregate consumption. You see a couple of interesting things. At least one interesting thing is this strong rise in staples consumption, along with severe falls in work-related, delayable, and social consumption. In other words, all of the various aspects. So everything fell, but staple consumption went up. So not surprisingly, a number of consumers were able to substitute away from, let us say, going out to the pub and having beer to buying beer just via their supermarkets. So that's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened is you can see these very substantial falls, but in April, you can start to see some recoveries. And in particular, social spending, this very bottom line here, has started to recover. Now, granted, it's still a long way down, at 40% below what it previously was before the lockdown, but it is nonetheless recovering somewhat. Here's the aggregate number here, which is the black line. The staple spending is somewhat flat, and the other categories, such as delayable and work-related, are coming back. Again, the delayable and work-related are still below where they were before, but there does seem to be at least some sort of trend to consumption coming back. And I should say, again, the work-related is kind of local transport and commuting. So that's quite related, obviously, to the degree of the lockdown and so forth. Okay, so again, let me go back to the question which I posed here. Again, as you look at that, you might say, well, let's just carry on releasing the lockdown. We've been doing the right thing. We've been gradually releasing the lockdown, and surely then all this spending is going to come back. And as I was mentioning earlier on, reverse the cascade. So here's the difficulty. What we need to understand is we need to understand the extent to which consumers, for example, in the social line, will be restoring their consumption. But what might happen is even if the lockdown is finished, they may feel very cautious about going out to the pub, going on a plane, going out to a restaurant. They may feel cautious about that because of the fear of infection. So what we need to disentangle is we need to disentangle the extent to which changes in these lines are due to the pure effect of opening up these shops and restaurants and so forth. And the changes in the lines are also due to the effect by which consumers are worried about the fear of infection. So let's try and get a sense of the balance between those things by looking at various different pieces of evidence. So the next thing to do is just to start asking consumers. Why don't we just ask them how they feel? That's not a terrible thing to do. Unfortunately, the ONS does an excellent survey called the Coronavirus and Social Impact Survey. You can click on that link. And this is the survey released last Friday, which relates to data between the 8th and the 12th of July. So just a couple of weeks ago. And it asks the following questions. How comfortable are you eating indoors at a restaurant this week? How comfortable indoors at a restaurant last week? And then here's eating outdoors this week and eating outdoors last week. So what do consumers say? So you can see that 50% of consumers, at least this week, are pretty uncomfortable about eating at a restaurant. So I've put that in red, the green line, the consumers who are comfortable about it or very comfortable. That admittedly has changed since the week before, where 60% in red there were uncomfortable about eating indoors. It's interesting that consumers are a bit more relaxed about eating outdoors. So as you can see, the first piece of evidence which starts to suggest that there may be something important going on in terms of thinking about consumer attitudes comes from these numbers here. Now, we don't know whether these people will actually or won't actually eat out, but if you had 60% of consumers who are uncomfortable about eating indoors, you'd think that that would probably have an effect on consumption, and that would be something that the Bank of England would have to look at. So that's the first issue about how consumers are feeling. The second issue comes from some cross-country data, and it gets to the question about why it is that on many country indicators, the UK doesn't seem to be doing as well as other countries on a range of different measures. So here's one plot of the data which does the following. On the horizontal axis is Google's social spending searches in June relative to a year ago. So this tells you in June how much Google searching there was relative to normal. And you can see that in the UK, there's a number here like -50, that's right down. Whereas in Austria, Denmark, and Germany, that number is less, but it's not nowhere near as big as the UK. Here on the vertical axis is the following data. This is new deaths per million in the week prior to the easing of the lockdown. So again, let me read that out if that's too small for you. Apologies if that is too small. I'll read it out. New deaths per million in the week prior to the easing of lockdowns. So here's the point. If consumers are worried about whether to go out to a restaurant or not, they've got to base that worry on some sort of statistic. Maybe one statistic is how worried they are about getting the infection. And maybe one measure of that is how much infections there were, maybe let's say before there was a lockdown. We'll see some more complicated data, more up-to-date data in just a second. And what you can see is that since the UK locked down when there are quite a lot of infections, that appears to have had an enduring effect on stopping consumers, at least on this measure, from going out. Whereas these countries here who locked down at the earlier stage in the infection cycle, they seem to have less reduction in social consumption. So again, this is pointing to the notion that the fear factor, as it were, is going to be an important determinant of consumption. Let me turn to a third example of this relationship between the fear factor and lockdown and consumption by going to Texas. So let's go out to Texas, and here's some data from Texas. And this data here is the change in the number of seated diners in Texas relative to last year, starting on the 24th of February. So this is data from a website called OpenTable. OpenTable, I don't know if you've ever used it, is a very nice aggregating website which allows you to book, and it does what it says on the tin, essentially. It allows you to book through the internet. And so a large number of people do this. This is not a bad measure. Okay, so what happened in Texas? Huge collapse in the number of people going out to restaurants, not a big surprise. And the Texas governor ended the lockdown. I forget exactly when it was. This is in the paper. There's an accompanying paper that goes with this talk, I should say, right around the end of April. And you can see then that people started going back up to restaurants. Okay, so perfectly sensible here. You ease the lockdown. The governor of Texas did this, eased the lockdown. People started going back to restaurants. What could possibly go wrong? So here's what did go wrong, which is the next piece of the data, is that around the middle of June, the number of people going to restaurants tailed off. Now, nothing had happened to the lockdown. It wasn't that there was a increase in the lockdown. In fact, if anything, things were getting more liberal. The initial release of the lockdown, restaurants were given instructions to be half full and only outdoors, and then they could be 3/4 full and so forth. So over this period here, the lockdown was eased, but then people started not going out to restaurants. And indeed, what had to happen was the lockdown had to be resumed on the I think it's on the 28th of June, if I remember correctly. So what's going on here? Why did this change? Why did the lockdown have to be resumed? Why was it that people stopped going out? And the answer is clear if we put on the infection rate. And here's the infection rate here, which is in the blue line. As you can see, people started going to restaurants in this initial stage here, and the infection rate was rather low. But here's the problem. The Texas infection rate started going up and up and up. And indeed, as it started going up, then the people stopped going to restaurants, and then it carried on going down further as the rate got higher and higher. So again, I think for us, an interesting and important piece of evidence, which suggests that it's not just the lockdown, it's the fear of infection that matters. And indeed, there's been lots of press coverage. The Texas governor himself, even during the lockdown, in fact, seemed to be aware that that may even increase the spread. Okay, so those are three ways of trying to factor in these behavioral types of notions. And the paper sets out a more formal model of all of this. I'm not going to go through the formal model. I'll just walk you through a little bit about what the model kind of looks at, and then I'll conclude with a couple more slides. So in a standard economic model, what do we have? We think of households who are saving for a rainy day. So on a bad day, when the day is raining, when there are adverse conditions, savings should fall. What do households do if they've got a temporary shock to their income? They should smooth their consumption. They don't want to completely stop consuming when things go bad. They've been saving as a way of being precautionary against all of that. They run down their savings, therefore, and then when things come back, then they've smoothed over their consumption and been able still to go on holiday and drive their car out to see their friends and so forth. So to a certain extent, in these conventional models, what saving does is it absorbs these falls in income. So a temporary fall in income, which people expect to be restored, is offset by those savings. However, there are other approaches, and I'd like to think about it in this way. Households might be saving for a rainy day, but maybe we're in a situation now where some are saving on a rainy day, which is to say, bad times have indeed come, people now face risk and uncertainty, they're not necessarily going to reduce their savings and consume, but they might increase their savings even more. So some of those savings for a rainy day will absorb the falls in income, but some, of course, are going to amplify their falls in income. How will they amplify them? Well, this is essentially, it's in this sentence here, that if people are sufficiently worried about the future, that drags down everybody's consumption, and then that all becomes self-fulfilling because everybody is saving, nobody is consuming, the economy carries on contracting, and that does indeed self-confirm the expectations that people had that the economy might contract. So in economics, this is often known as the paradox of thrift. Everybody's trying to save, but saving drags down the whole economy, and so everybody can't save the case. And in the paper, I show a number of different inflation profiles in this case. Essentially what you end up with is you end up with a very depressed economy with very low inflation. That's this blue line here. Whereas in these other economies where people are using their savings to buffer against these shocks, you get somewhat higher inflation. So again, I refer you to the paper. Let me finish, ladies and gentlemen, just with the last couple of slides and make some conclusions. So as it says here, as the lockdown unwinds, it's my view that public anxiety and the perception of health will be an important determinant of recovery. Let me go back again to the ONS, who do these interesting questions. And one of their questions is a sort of potpourri question about how in general do people feel about their anxiety. Here's average levels of anxiety, and the 20th to 30th of March are very high. Those indeed have been falling, but they're still above the pre-COVID anxiety score. And for those of you who are interested in all of this, people are also asked about various other attitudinal questions about loneliness and so forth as well. It's a very interesting, I think, questionnaire. So as long as these average levels of anxiety persist, then I think there's quite a chance that people will be saving for those precautionary reasons and pulling the economy down and pulling the recovery back in the way that I've described. Now, a couple of things which are going to be important for understanding all of this. So one is going to be the source of public information. Here's a question here from the Opinions and Lifestyle Survey, which I've been mentioning, again, the ONS survey. Do you feel you've got enough information about how to protect yourself? 85% of people say yes, 8% of people say no. That figure, I mean, is gratifyingly quite high. So it looks like people are quite well informed. It's changed a little bit over the time, and it shows how key public information is going to be. I was interested also in what people think the most helpful source of information is on COVID. I was particularly interested in this thing here, given that which is the source of social media as being a helpful source of information, given that there are various cures suggested for coronavirus on Twitter and so forth. But that's only 5% of people are relying on that. What's key, it seems to be, is the NHS and the TV and the radio. So I think, again, lots of interesting studies to be done on public perceptions and public attitudes. Okay, let me give you a final slide and just try to conclude, and then I'll turn it back to David and the team. So what do I think here? As I've tried to say, that the health crisis is both a supply and a demand shock. The future recovery depends upon the releasing of the lockdown. That raises the supply. Theatres can open, pubs can open, and so forth. But as I've tried to argue, that the response to demand depends much more on expectations of health and the economic outlook. There's some key issues then that arise from that. One is the state of health provision, which I want to mention something about in a second, and the other is about the fear of unemployment and low income, which I kind of touched on, and I want to say something about now. So just to go through all of those just for a second, just to illustrate some of these key issues. So let me start with firms. Here's a picture. I promised we'd go to Phantom of the Opera in South Korea. Phantom of the Opera in Seoul is open. It's one of the almost the only place where the Phantom of the Opera is playing. But there are a lot of things that you've got to do if you go there. You have to go with your phone. As you can see there, the receptionists are all wearing masks, and there's a hand sanitizing bottle there as well. So there are a lot of health provisions that have to go through. You put your phone out as well, you don't touch anything, and you confirm your tickets in that way. So there's lots of scope here for firms, well, there's both necessity and scope here for firms to provide health, as it were, privately, which is to say, provide a safe environment for their customers, and therefore the potential for them to compete in quality to attract customers. There's going to be a big test on the management capability to adapt. As I've mentioned in other speeches before, I think there are going to be severe tests on leadership and motivation, and the way that good firms are going to be able to design their organizations to motivate people who, for example, are working from home. So I expect to see a lot of competition in that side, with some important implications for firms. A second key issue is, if this is right, there are going to be gigantic social returns to quick and cheap testing and to reliable local information. That is to say, if, as we saw in Texas, for example, people are really worried about local infection rates affecting their economic activity, then somebody who can provide information on the local infection rates, and somebody who can invent a very quick and instantaneous testing mechanism is going to be a really good idea. So can I recommend to everybody unreservedly Professor Tim Spector, who's from King's College London. He has this terrific COVID tracking app. I think there are already around 4 million people who are on that, providing information about themselves. Can I recommend everybody logs onto that, and that's going to help people get that local information. And here's a picture, if you'll forgive me, from Imperial itself. Here's a picture of my wonderful colleague Molly Stevens, who is attempting to develop a rapid coronavirus test. If that was successful, that would be massively helpful. The third thing I want to say is that there are a host of social and political issues around trust and testing and compliance and so forth. In South Korea, they've got quite a different, sort of testing and track and trace kind of method as well. So I'll leave to others those social and political issues, but they're obviously going to be important as well. Finally, let me say something about monetary policy. A lot of concern, or I feel a lot of concern, that, as it says on the slide there, cautious consumers worried about unemployment, worried about health risks, they might hold back the economy. The response, therefore, of the economy is going to depend crucially upon those expectations, which in turn depends upon the public and private health provision and so forth. And it's going to depend crucially upon the activities of other people in the economy. If everybody's trying to save, that might drag the whole economy down as well. So let me stop there and hand it back to David. And thanks very much, everybody, for your attention.
Jonathan, that was terrific, extraordinary coverage.
So I stopped sharing.
It's Stephen. Yes, that's great.
Sorry, David.
That's great. A huge range of variety of questions have come up. So let me plunge straight in. You started the presentation with this discussion around the input-output model. Does the speed and magnitude of recovery reduce the longer the recession or the lockdown continues?
So I think
we need a new model.
So that's a great question, David, and it's a difficult one because I think it depends upon these behavioural issues. If we have look at it the other way around, if we release the lockdown somewhat prematurely, as it looks like may well have been the case in Texas, then we have this very difficult sort of self-defeating cycle, which is that we release the lockdown early, which you'd think, oh, that would be good for activity, wouldn't it? Yeah. But then more people get infected, and then people hold themselves back. So what's crucial about this is the interaction between people's expectations, the public health provisions, and so forth. And it's somehow or other getting the sweet spot right about reopening the economy, but in the context of as safe an economy as we possibly can, which will keep people from being afraid and reacting in the way that we saw in Texas.
Thank you. So the model is essentially a GDP model, but or a model of economic activity. But you brought in a lot of other data. A question from Pascal Bassak, which is: should we be looking at different measures of output? So you've done, I know in the past, a lot of work around a measurement of society's output. Are we looking at the right measures? Because there are elements around health, around happiness, around unemployment.
That's a great question, and it's an ongoing debate. I think the honest answer at the moment, David, is that our entire bandwidth is taken up by just trying to understand GDP. But thanks, Ascor, if I got your name correctly. Apologies if I mispronounce your name. I mean, it's a good question. I should say that the output of the health sector and the output of the education sector is, of course, part of GDP. So to the extent that hospitals and so forth are treating people better, then that should show up as an increase in GDP. But we're not measuring happiness. We're not measuring the degree of comfort, for example, that people feel as they go out. We're not measuring, we saw that slide earlier on, David, on anxiety. We're not measuring things like anxiety. I think at the moment we should stick to GDP, but we should have in our mind a dashboard of these other types of measures. And it's great that the statistical authorities are going around attempting to try to ferret out what these other measures are as well.
Okay, thank you. You touched on the international component on this, and there's been several questions around this. So let me try and combine several, which was in the great financial crisis, we saw significant international coordination between central banks and international organizations. In this financial crisis, are we doing better, worse, the same, or it's not relevant?
Well, since I have the great honor and privilege to be sitting at a central bank, of course I'm going to tell you that we're doing much better, but you shouldn't take that from me. What I should say, I think this is a really important point and gets to the very nice question, is that we're not in a situation where the banks are all collapsing. So in the financial crisis, the banks were absolutely on their last legs, and there was a whole set of horrible problems around all of that. This is a horrible crisis. Let me not minimize that at all, but it is at least a horrible crisis in the context of a much safer banking system. And a much safer banking system has come about through the efforts of regulators and the efforts of academics, including those at Imperial, if you'll forgive my having a small plug, to better improve financial stability and better improve the capital resilience of the banks. So I think that's the way to view this relative to the financial crisis, and it seems to me is at least one blessing on what is otherwise a difficult landscape.
Okay, thank you. So there are a number of questions a little bit more broadly, as you've touched on your role as the member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. So interesting question. Let me read it. We see many companies issuing debt. We're actually seeing record profits for some of the investment banks, and probably the two are somewhat related. But we're also seeing record job losses, particularly among some of the lower paid, as your chart indicated. How does the bank's buying of government and corporate debt help the millions who are struggling?
Excellent question. And an important communications issue for the bank. So the bank, as you know, as everyone on the call knows, has got an inflation target. Our mandate is to hit the inflation target and keep the economy stabilized and keep the economy on an even tack. We believe that that mandate helps everybody because it keeps the economy stable and it's a background against which firms can safely borrow and invest in the types of new technologies that we've seen firms have got to do, and workers can make their savings decisions in the knowledge that they won't be wiped out by savings. So all of the efforts that we make are designed with that in mind. They're not designed to help Peter rather than Paul. They're not designed, to help this company rather than that company and so forth. They're designed to try to help everybody in that regard. And what I would argue, and I think that there's a lot of support for that, is that a credible bank keeping inflation low and keeping the economy on track as best as it possibly can is actually good for unemployed people and the people who are losing their jobs and the young and so forth, as we've just seen. And I think by the bank, sticking to its target and trying to provide that stability, that's the best we can do for helping everybody.
Okay. Well, thinking about Peter and Paul, actually, there's a related question here. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Imagine the government's got the Bank of England has got a policy of buying debt to achieve some of the things you just described. When many people are concerned about sort of the moral hazard of financial rescues. And how should we think through, say, a government, the Bank of England, buying debt, corporate debt, from a very well capitalized, very prudently run company, compared to a company that, for example, is extremely highly leveraged and has been paying dividends for many years? Do we support both equally? Does the bank have some sort of judgment to make around who and how and whose debt to buy?
It's a great question, and it may well be a judgment to make, but I don't think it's a judgment for the bank to make. And part of the difficulty is it's very difficult for the bank or anybody else to judge a company with, as it were, good debt and a company with bad debt. After all, if we think about the pharmaceutical companies, we are desperate for a cure, for a vaccine, and a cure for COVID. The one thing we would like the pharmaceutical companies to do probably is to borrow even more, to invest even more, to try to find a cure for this terrible disease. So there you would say, well, we want to encourage debt. So I don't think the Bank of England should be in the situation of choosing between good and bad. That's a matter for fiscal authorities, for tax authorities to do one thing or the other. I know, provide an R&D tax credit, for example, but not something for the bank to do.
Okay. Alistair Dutton's asked a question. Does the bank have any responsibility for a green stimulus package? Now, clearly, this is again goes back to the role of Treasury versus the bank. But nevertheless, all policies have implications. Should the bank be concerned about or supporting some sort of green or sustainable intervention?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Alistair. It's a very live issue at the moment. I think at the moment the bank has to stick to its mandate. And its mandate, as I mentioned earlier on, is to support the economy, to make sure it doesn't get stuck in a very low inflation equilibrium. And what that means is, in practice, as people will know, the bank buys government gilt-edged securities, but it also buys investment grade assets as well, regardless of the different type of company. Now, if the Treasury were to say, well, we need to change your mandate, then obviously we would do that, because we have to stick to what our mandate is. But at the moment, although I think it's a difficult issue, it's something for the bank, I think, to wait for its mandate to be changed rather than taking an independent decision.
Two or three questions here around the stimulus, which is do we have any more capacity left to cut interest rates, or is it all about quantitative easing? Or would you rather not answer that question at all?
It is a tricky question, and it's a live question. And the answer is that I think what we've seen over the last few months is the bank does indeed have the tools to calm, in particular, dysfunctional markets. So certainly in March, when the coronavirus first became very salient to everybody, there were huge spikes in various yields. Sorry, I shouldn't bore people with the technicalities, but essentially a number of those crucial financial markets became highly dysfunctional. And what we don't want is, we don't want a situation in which firms who are trying to do the right thing by their suppliers, trying to do the right thing by their customers, trying to do the right thing by their workers, we don't want them to then go to financial markets and find that financial markets are so dysfunctional they can't get the credit that they desperately need. So the bank stepped in a very big way in doing all of that. And the previous governor had been instrumental, governor, I should say, had been instrumental in setting all of that up and played a terrific leadership role in doing that. And I believe that calmed those markets, and that was very, very helpful. So there is always the role of the bank to do that. As I say, I think our previous few months have shown that that was actually a very helpful role, and we retain that power to act in that way.
Terrific. In many ways, the bank has, I think, has been a model for some other institutions around the world. It comes back to this coordination element. Does the bank have is it sharing its expertise? And clearly the data sets are different, each economy is different, but this is a global crisis. Are we, how or do we share our expertise, your expertise indeed, with many of the other countries who are wrestling with, frankly, very, very similar challenges?
So I think there's a lot of sharing that goes on, and banking in particular is by its very nature an international business. So there are cooperative arrangements between all the various central banks, and that's all to be encouraged. I think, David, if I can take your question in a slightly different direction, what any central bank needs to be, and it's for others to judge whether we are case, is any central bank needs to be very nimble. And we haven't had a pandemic, not at least all that recently. And as I've tried to indicate, what I think the bank needs to figure out in order to make judgments about the path of the recovery is things like people's attitudes to safety at work, things like people's understanding of public health, people's understanding of how things are going to be, if they go to a restaurant, how is the restaurant going to react, and all that kind of stuff. So, we never had to do any of that before, nor before did we had to look at this very high frequency credit card data, which literally comes in sort of every day, and deal with all of that, because we weren't dealing with such a crisis. So any bank, any institution has to be very nimble in that regard. And I think that's the main demand on central banks nowadays. I believe there's a lot of sharing going on between central banks on that type of technology. But if I can broaden it out, I mean, it's a demand on any institution. So any firm, who's, anybody who works at a firm, anybody who's self-employed, watching this video will know that, the world throws many new things at you. And so there are lots of extra demands. And what I've tried to sketch out today is some of the data points and some of the particular dimensions of the economy, which we hadn't collected data on before, but now we have to look at very strongly in order to figure out which way the economy is going.
Terrific, thank you. I think we've got time for perhaps a couple more questions. At the beginning, we talked a little bit about particularly for example, within Imperial, how we bring different people together to solve problems. And one of the, I guess, accusations that's often thrown at government is that there is insufficient joined up thinking. So, for example, between economics and health, and indeed, notwithstanding economists, perhaps not enough experts in the room. From your perspective of sort of wrestling with this, do you think that within government we should be confident that we have the right number of experts in the room with joined up thinking between health and economics and psychology? Or is there some other way we should perhaps be organising?
No, that's a fascinating question. And as I say, anybody involved in any institution will have their own view on that. I won't opine, if you'll forgive me, David, on what the government are and are not doing, other than to again point out that at least from the economic point of view, what understanding the recovery and making good policy is going to need is an understanding of a remarkable width of dimensions of different aspects of all of this. So maybe in the old days it was enough to understand the intricacies of the banking system and the intricacies of forward markets. That's not enough now. What we also need to understand as an economics community is the reactions of people to unknown events and so forth, and the provision of information and all that kind of thing. So we certainly need that case is the case for joined up thinking. I think has never been higher, but possibly never been more difficult as well.
Yeah. Let me ask you the last question. This is from Alexander Rubin. And there's a couple of variations on this question as well from others as well, which is, we've looked at some of the short and perhaps medium-term impacts. Will COVID result in a permanent shift in the shape of the economy? We're not going to have skyscrapers anymore. So, will it result in a different shape? And that was one of your first slides. And what does it mean for businesses?
I think it's Alexander asked the question. Thanks, Alexander. I think it's a great question. So let me, making predictions about the future is a fool's game. So let me try and be a fool, and people will come back to me in a couple of years' time and replay this video and tell me how wrong I was. So it seems to me that the return to real estate may well be not looking so rosy for all the reasons that were possibly behind Alexander's question. People maybe aren't going to go to work anymore. The premium on center cities may not be so large. So you might imagine that those returns aren't going to look so good. On the other hand, I think there are going to be tremendous returns to well-managed businesses. The challenges that businesses are going to have to face are going to be, and are already facing, are going to have to be nimble, to adapt to this crisis. We haven't talked very much, David, about working from home. I mean, everybody who's at home will know that the coordination issues, how you interact with your team, how you interact with your manager, how you establish a good track record, especially for young workers who haven't formed networks yet. All of those things are very difficult when you're working from home. And so the payoffs then to a well-designed business and a well-managed business with lots of what I might call organizational capital and lots of empathetic managers who are able to lead their way through this crisis, I think those are going to be very large. And so I expect to see if maybe there might be a bit less investment in commercial real estate, but a lot more investment in organizational design and improving management style amongst companies.
Jonathan, thank you. It's a terrific way to actually perhaps leave it, which is in some ways it is our challenge, and that there are some companies, if I can paraphrase slightly, which was risky, there are some companies that will, even given the constraints, thrive if they can invest in social capital and innovate, and others that will struggle, that will struggle more. I've got enough questions to keep you in for another hour. I also know that you're unbelievably busy between the Bank of England, various other roles, and certainly a lot of teaching at Imperial as well. So I want to do two things before we close. Firstly, thank you enormously for finding the time today. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. The second thing I wanted to do was, and if I can do it quickly enough, is share the next webinar, which is hugely relevant to what we've been talking about, which is Professor Carol Proper, who is, amongst other things, president of the Royal Economic Society, will be speaking in September on much more about the health side of this. She's a terrifically expert and a wonderful compliment to Jonathan. I'd like to thank you for joining the Imperial Future Matters webinar series. And lastly, again, a huge thank you to Jonathan. Thank you all, and look forward to seeing you again.